The sterile hum of the overhead lights buzzed through the cold, tiled room. Instruments gleamed and the faint scent of antiseptic filled the room. Dr. Evelyn Moore, an experienced coroner, methodically worked her way through the autopsy, her gloved hand steady as she reached the most delicate stage. Before her lay the body of John Halstead, recently pronounced dead after a violent car accident. The medical examiner's assistant watched quietly from the other side of the table as Evelyn delicately extracted the heart, holding it gently in her hands. She examined its chambers and tissue with a clinical focus, unaware that the silent room was about to be disturbed in the most unsettling way possible. Suddenly, John Halstead's eyes shot open. It was so swift and unnatural that Evelyn didn't notice it at first, but her assistant gasped, stepping back. The assistant's expression was a mix of horror and disbelief, his face drained of color. Evelyn glanced up sharply. "What's wrong with you?" she asked, annoyed by his apparent break in composure. But before he could answer, she heard something impossible. A sound like a faint thud, a rhythm that shouldn't exist, echoed from the very organ she held. A heartbeat. Her eyes widened and she instinctively looked down at the heart in her hands. It pulsed. Weakly but unmistakably, it pulsed. Suddenly she heard a shallow, raspy breath escape from the body on the table. John's eyes, once lifeless, were now filled with a terrifying awareness. His pupils dilated, his chest barely rising in labored, uneven gasps. His face was a mask of pain and confusion. The assistant stumbled backward, knocking over a tray of instruments with a loud clang. "Dr. Moore, he's alive," he shouted, though his voice trembled as if his mind was struggling to believe his own words. Evelyn stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat. This couldn't be happening. John Halstead had been dead for hours. The bruises, the fractures, the trauma from the accident. It was impossible for him to be breathing. His heart had stopped. She had the organ in her hands for goodness sake, yet here it was, beating between her fingers. His lips moved, struggling to form words. His voice, weak and hoarse, finally managed to croak out, "What happened?" Evelyn dropped the heart. It hit the floor with a sickening thud and the rhythmic pulse ceased. For a moment everything went still. The assistant looked at the body on the table in utter shock. John's eyes were now vacant once more, his chest no longer moving. The impossible had vanished as quickly as it had appeared. But Evelyn couldn't shake the image, the sensation of that heart pulsing in her hands, the life that had flickered back into the dead. Shaken, she knelt down and retrieved the heart from the floor, her hands trembling. She stared at it, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But it remained still, lifeless, just as it should be. Her assistant, now ghostly pale, whispered, "Should we report this?" Evelyn looked at the lifeless form of John Halstead, his face now calm, his eyes forever closed. She swallowed hard and shook her head. "No one would believe us," she said quietly, her voice hollow. "It never happened." Yet deep down, as she returned to her work, she knew the truth. Something had happened. Something far beyond death had stirred in that room, and the echo of a heartbeat still lingered in the silence. Evelyn resumed her work, but her hands no longer held the confidence they once did. Every movement felt strained, deliberate. The memory of John Halstead's fleeting, impossible life, or whatever that had been, clung to her thoughts like a stain. The assistant stood far from the table now, his eyes never leaving the body. A ringing silence stretched over the room, but Evelyn's mind screamed. Was she going mad? Had they both hallucinated the same impossible event? And what if they hadn't? She forced herself to proceed with the autopsy, trying to bury her fear beneath years of medical training. As her scalpel hovered above the next incision, a strange, cold draft brushed against the back of her neck. She paused, glancing up at the room's sealed windows. Nothing should have moved the air in this basement-level morgue. The chill was unnatural. The hairs on her arms prickled and a creeping sense of dread tightened around her chest. She felt watched, but by what? John's body lay still, lifeless, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something more than death lingered in the room. She leaned over his corpse, preparing for the next cut, but her heart pounded with the irrational certainty that his eyes would open again at any moment. The silence was suddenly broken by a sharp, metallic clang. Evelyn jumped, her scalpel slipping from her hand and clattering onto the tiled floor. Across the room, a tray of instruments had toppled over, on its own. The assistant stifled a whimper, his back now pressed against the wall, fear etched deeply into his face. Did you see that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn forced herself to breathe, her rational mind fighting the panic rising in her throat. "It's just a draft," she lied, though she knew full well that no air could move down here. Before she could say anything else, the lights flickered. Once, twice. The third flicker left the room plunged in complete darkness for several agonizing seconds. When the light returned, it was dimmer, as though the power was slowly draining. But that wasn't the worst part. John Halstead's body had shifted. His head was now slightly turned to the side, his face tilted as though he was looking right at her. She was certain she hadn't moved him, and neither had her assistant, who was still frozen in the corner, wide-eyed and shaking. Evelyn swallowed hard, her breath shallow. She stepped closer to the body, against every instinct screaming for her to run. Her hands trembled as she leaned in, almost as if drawn by an invisible force. She told herself she was imagining it. Bodies could shift after death. The muscles relaxed. Nerves could fire randomly. That was all it was. But when she reached for his face, intending to turn it back to its original position, she felt a sharp, icy burn on her skin, as though she had touched something frozen. And then, just as her fingers made contact, John's eyes snapped open again. This time, there was no fleeting moment of confusion. His pupils were dilated, wide and black as voids, staring straight into her. His lips parted, a gurgling sound rising from his throat, no longer human. His body convulsed on the table, bones cracking audibly as if something inside him was breaking free. Evelyn stumbled backward, her heart hammering in her chest. The assistant screamed and bolted for the door, but it slammed shut with a deafening bang just as he reached it. His hands beat frantically against the steel, but it wouldn't budge. John, or what had once been John, rose from the table, his movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. His chest cavity was still open, ribs exposed. But the impossible thing was that his heart, the one she had dropped, now lay back inside, beating furiously. His head twitched, turning toward Evelyn. He opened his mouth wider, the sound deepening, morphing into a low, horrible growl that sent icy waves of terror flooding through her body. "Help me!" the assistant shouted, banging on the door as the lights flickered again. Evelyn stumbled back further, nearly slipping on the floor, her eyes glued to the twisted form of John. But as he took another step forward, his limbs convulsing unnaturally, she saw something worse, something that broke the last thread of her sanity. The heart she had once held pulsed more violently in his chest, but now it wasn't just flesh. It was moving. Something dark and serpentine was coiled around it, slithering through his veins. Tendrils of black smoke spilled from the open chest cavity, swirling around him as the lights dimmed further. John's body convulsed violently, his mouth stretched wide as he gasped out a single, mangled word. "Free." The lights went out. In the suffocating blackness, Evelyn heard the assistant's frantic, panicked breaths, the scraping of his shoes on the floor, and then silence. A wet, choking sound replaced his cries, followed by a sickening thud. The smell of iron filled the room. Evelyn's breath hitched as a cold presence loomed closer, enveloping her in darkness. She tried to scream, but the sound died in her throat. She felt the chill creep up her spine, heard the raspy, unnatural breaths just inches from her face. Then, with a final cold breath against her neck, a voice that was no longer John's whispered in the darkness. Now, it's your turn.